My name's not Josh, it's Victor. Professor, if you're nasty. Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Horror Movie Syllabus. My name is Professor Victor, and I'll be your host as we go through all of the essential, noteworthy, interesting, and notorious modern horror films. If you're new to the channel, I recommend you check out the introduction video. There's a link to that in the description below, and it'll give you a good idea of what the Horror Movie Syllabus is all about. But in short, we take a particular subgenre of horror, and then we pick 3 movies from that subgenre to explore. And today, the subgenre we're talking about is video nasties. And I know that a lot of you out there have been waiting for us to get to the video nasties. I know that you guys know a lot about it. Some of you actually lived through it. And so you have a special affinity for or knowledge about this subgenre. But for those of you that aren't really familiar with what a video nasty is or what this is all about, let me give you just the briefest of overviews. Back in the early 80s in the UK, the British Board of Film Classification, or BBFC, basically started cracking down on videotapes because of certain religious groups being led by a woman named Mary Whitehouse that was trying to stir up basically controversy about these violent movies, these horror films that were available to children because, theoretically when they'd go to the cinema, they wouldn't be able to get in to see them because they were rated R or whatever, but they could go and rent them from the video store because there's really no rules about that. So under an older obscenity law, the government started not only seizing certain movies, certain videotapes, but also prosecuting people who owned them and rented them out. So you could actually be arrested and prosecuted for renting out things like Texas Chainsaw Massacre. And that's the interesting thing is they came up with a list of movies that were considered, banned. They were whatever. They were not acceptable to be rented to anybody, not just children, to anybody. And early on, there's a lot of confusion by the police and whatnot because they don't know what movies qualify. In fact, I think Dolly Parton's Best Little Whorehouse in Texas got seized because they didn't know from the titles what was and what wasn't, supposed to be seized or confiscated. And so they made a list of, I think, 72 movies that were prosecutable under the law. And these movies are known as video nasties. And the list kind of changed over time. They got movies that fell off the list, movies got added to the list as they were successfully or unsuccessfully prosecuted. But they were known colloquially and in the press as video nasties. So that's where the term comes from. And it basically is referring to movies that were banned in the UK, movies that were considered too extreme for one reason or another to be seen by people in the UK and could be, punishable by up to jail time for having and distributing. So it's a really interesting and kind of quaint, but also like scary time in history to look back on it and realize that people could be, prosecuted for, sharing movies that we all kind of just look at now with a little bit of, well, sometimes some of them hold up, honestly, and some of them don't. But that's actually kind of what we're here to talk about today because honestly, we've actually talked about several video nasties on the channel already. I've, addressed many movies in other subgenres that were on this list of video nasties, like I Spit on Your Grave, Cannibal Holocaust, Last House on the Left, even Tenebrae, which we talked about recently. These movies were on the list at one point in time. So they were considered video nasties. So we've already dug into several of the movies that are on this list. So I'm not going to repeat any movies. That's the rule of the syllabus. You can't repeat movies. You only use the movie once per subgenre. So what am I going to talk about today? Well, I want to talk about movies that were, banned as video nasties and some of the reasons why. So when we look at them today, we're going to be going in order, undergraduate, graduate, postgraduate, like we usually do, in order of how much notoriety they have. And it's going to be worth noting up front that we're talking about how much notoriety they have, not whether or not that notoriety is deserved, or whether or not they really should have been banned. Because we're going to talk about that as we go along. Because what I'd like to point out is that some of the movies that were on this list, by today's standards, you kind of look at it and go, really, like that movie was banned. And then there's other movies that you're like, yeah, I can kind of understand why they were banned. And then there's yet even other movies where you understand the reason why they were banned, but you're still just kind of like, that really feels like it kind of misses the mark a little bit. And we're going to talk about all of that in today's video. So let's not hold off any longer. Let's get right into the video nasties. The first video nasty that we're looking at today, the undergraduate level selection, is Island of Death. Island of Death came out in 1976 and is definitely has less notoriety than the other movies that we're about to talk about for sure. It's definitely less well known. It's not as in the mainstream public's knowledge. But don't let that lack of notoriety fool you into thinking that this movie is not notorious and maybe warranting of actually having made the video nastiest list, because it definitely earns its stripes for sure. But we're going to get out into all of that in just a minute. First, if you haven't seen it before, the movie's about this couple that go to a Greek island, I believe it's Mykonos, ostensibly on like a honeymoon or some sort of romantic trip. And while they're on their trip, they start a killing spree. It turns out they are sexual sadists, and they are basically going after pretty much anybody that strikes their fancy, that has the unfortunate misfortune of crossing their paths. So they kind of basically go on this crazy killing spree, and very gory, very graphic, very taboo in many ways, and leading to one of the more taboo twists at the end of the movie. But we, of course, won't spoil that because we don't want to spoil it for anybody who hasn't seen it before. And this whole video is going to be a video of me not necessarily recommending things to people, but just kind of talking about my own personal experiences with them. And this movie is a trip of a movie. This movie is wild to me for a number of reasons, but one that it wasn't until I did the research for this video is the director. It's directed by a man named Nico Masterakis, a Greek man who is a fascinating individual. Pre-directing this movie, he had a career as a journalist that is pretty fascinating. And then he also was a music producer for a while. He produced many Greek acts, including Yanni, I believe. He was a TV announcer or was on a TV show. He did a lot of really interesting stuff. I don't want to spend a lot of time talking about it, but just check out the Wikipedia page on him. And a really interesting career before coming to America and making, low budget exploitation flicks, which this is, and it's the one he's known for the most outside of his other careers. And it's notable. It is. It's a really violent and taboo movie, and that word I keep using over and over again because it's really a good word to sum up what's going on here. Because in addition to the graphic violence, you've also got a lot of rape in this movie, bestiality, incest, torture. This movie checks off like all the sexual sadism taboo boxes. It really goes there in a kind of an unflinching manner. And it's not that I would say that I love it. I just it's more like I respect that it was not gonna hide from this stuff, but at the same time realize that it really is in there to be just kind of like as exploitative as you can possibly be. And on that level, it succeeds wonderfully. There is a lot of violence and sexual violence on screen. So if that's not your bag, this movie is definitely not for you. But the question is, does it really have any merit? Or is it just exploitation? And the answer is the movie looks pretty good, largely because of a really gorgeous location. It's shot at these outdoors and kind of washed out, sunny scenes with violence in there that just looks really stark and shocking and striking is maybe a better word. Striking. I really like the way this movie looks. I also like just how bug nuts crazy it gets. It gets crazy pretty early on and just keeps going crazy. It really is a bizarre movie that doesn't seem to have a really strong plot, and the ending is a little bit weird, and that's the best way I can put it. But and there's a twist at the end that is gross. There's no other way to put it. It's gross. But I kind of love how unabashedly ridiculously over the top everything is, to the point where it's so over the top where I can't even really be that affected by it. And maybe that's just me being an old dog who is kind of a little desensitized to things, but like this movie, while shocking, don't get me wrong, I don't want to undersell the violence and the sexual violence in particular. It doesn't. It's so much that it just almost starts to you feel like almost numb to it. So it doesn't ruin the experience for me to have this stuff just kind of stuffed in there, all this stuff kind of filling up this movie because I don't know, just because it's just so silly. It's just like, is this really like we're starting out here and we're gonna escalate from there? Yes, yes, you are. So again, not gonna recommend this per se because it's definitely not for everybody. But at a minimum, check out the director and check out his career because that's pretty fascinating. But this movie, it's easy to see why it wound up being a video nasty. It's easy to see why not just in the UK, but many countries worldwide have banned this movie. It's actually quite banned quite a bit. It's one of the more banned movies, from what I understand, if I'm to believe the research that I did. And it's easy to see why, because again, it's just got everything it can think of to be offensive in there, pretty much in there. And so, definitely not going to be for everybody. Questionable if it's for anybody, but apparently it's for me. I actually find this movie to be very interesting and fascinating. I guess I'll say I like this movie, even though that's a weird thing to say. Watch it at your own risk. If you've seen it, I would like to know what you think about it because it's definitely, like I said, not for everybody. And there's a lot of stuff in here that should make people look away from the screen, make their stomach turn, stuff like that. So I'd be curious to see what your experience was watching this movie. Are you like me and a little desensitized to it? Was it scandalous for you? What was your experience like watching this movie? Please, by all means, share with me in the comment below. And if you decide to watch this movie, definitely let me know how that experience goes for you because I really want to hear about that. But you've been warned. We're starting out strong with this one. Just because it's not as well known, don't think it's not gruesome because it is. And watch at your own risk. The next video nasty that we're talking about today, the graduate level selection, is the Driller Killer. The Driller Killer came out in 1979 and is directed by auteur director Abel Ferrara and is a really interesting video nasty to talk about because the name of the movie, and more importantly, the cover art of the movie, is probably what drives its notoriety much more than the actual content of the film. But I'll explain. First, if you haven't seen it before, the movie follows an unstable painter, an artist, played by Abel Ferrara himself, who is living with a woman and they've got another roommate and they have money problems basically. They're pretty much broke because he hasn't sold his painting yet and he's under a lot of stress and there's a new neighbors that are a band making a lot of noise and his girlfriend and her friend are also maybe having affair and other affairs with people and he's really kind of going nuts and it's all too much for him and he eventually snaps and starts killing homeless people with a power drill and goes on a bit of a killing rampage and it sounds a lot more lurid than it actually is. I'm going to stop there so not to spoil it, but it's important to note that this movie, from the title and from the description I just gave you, sounds like a really great slasher movie. But it's really more of like a psychological character study of a killer, kind of like this, psychological horror of somebody kind of losing their minds. And it's pretty good, but it's definitely not what you were expecting it to be from not only the title, but also the cover art. And the cover art's something I want to fixate on because that is pretty much everybody pretty much agrees that's why it got on the video nasties list. See, that cover art of the drill going towards the guy head, which is not the video cover I have, but it's the one that it was there in the 80s. And it was the one that they were advertising in like trade magazines and stuff like that. They put that image in the trade magazines, and that's part of what drew the ire of the conservatives who didn't want these movies being distributed. And the movie itself is nowhere near as gory and gruesome and awful as that image would have you believe it is. But that got people's attention. That is almost certainly why it's on the list, and it's often referred to as the movie that kind of sparked the whole video nasties thing. It kind of comes from that image being on there. At least that's what a lot of the research showed to me. And that's kind of wild because again, if you watch this movie, you will scratch your head going, "Really, this movie is banned? This movie was banned. People got arrested for having and renting out this movie." Yeah, because it's really much more psychological than violent. There is violence in the movie, don't get me wrong, but it's definitely few and far between. It's actually kind of slow. If you're expecting like a slasher and a lot of kills, this movie's gonna feel slow to you. And it's a surprise to me when I was revisiting it for this video because I saw this movie as a kid because something called The Driller Killer. Young Professor Victor was absolutely going to watch that movie. And as a kid, I remember really liking this movie. I remember thinking it was really intense and really wild. So I was shocked to come back to it after, God, almost 40 years, like 35 years, and really surprised to find that it did not live up to those expectations at all. I think maybe as a kid, I must have just been really more enamored with something being called Driller Killer and having been banned in the UK, not banned out here, of course. But I must have been really enthralled by being allowed to see it rather than actually appreciating for what it was because I can't imagine as a kid that this held my attention as much as I seem to remember it holding. It's wild. It really is like a kind of a character study of this artist played by Abel Ferrara, playing it himself. And here's the thing about the movie: it's not great, man. Like it's like I said, it's a little slow, it's a little dull in some places. Large places it's dull. The acting is not great. Abel Ferrara is okay. The rest of the cast not great at all. Some really clunky, rough acting. Abel Ferrara's dialogue is rough. Not just the delivery of it, but like the dialogue itself, which I believe he wrote. I believe he wrote and directed this movie. It's a little bit rough, and it's interesting because Abel Ferrara, I called him an auteur, and I used the word kind of trepidatiously because I mean he's done some really impressive, interesting work. Like he did Miss 45, he did Bad Lieutenant. He did The Addiction. Some of these movies we've actually talked about. And he also had his roots. I think his first movie was pornography. Like he did a porn movie to basically pay the bills. And you would kind of from that background, you'd expect this movie to be sleazier than it is, but it's really not. Like by today's standards, it feels pretty tame. By Island of Death standards, it feels very tame. And it kills me that this movie is banned. It's part of why I wanted to talk about it in this video is because it's notorious. Again, it's called The Driller Killer. It's got that image. It's got that reputation. It's Abel Ferrara, but it's really A, not that bad, and B, kind of bad as a movie. So it's a perfect example of just like how the hysteria of the video nasties caught up a lot of stuff in its wake that you really kind of just like, really? Again, when you hear Driller Killer and you see that image, you're like, okay, yeah, sure. But when you see the movie itself, you're like, this movie really didn't warrant the kind of uproar that it caused at all. It'd be hilarious if it wasn't kind of depressing that it caused so much trouble and people got arrested for this and stuff like that. It's a bummer that so many people in the UK have had trouble watching these movies and the better ones like Texas Chainsaw Massacre because of basically this movie sparking this crazy outrage. So in that sense, it's unfortunate, really more than funny. But I can't help just shake my head. It's like really, and if you haven't seen this movie, watch it and see if you agree with me because it really just isn't it isn't that bad. It's really not terribly offensive at all compared to what you would expect it to be. And I'm guessing some of you have seen it, so you can comment down below. Like, do you agree with me on that? Do you think that it's pretty tame, all things considered? Or do you actually think it warranted being a video nasty and being banned? Let me know in the comments below. And the last video nasty we're examining today, the postgraduate level selection is Faces of Death. Faces of Death came out in 1978 and is pretty well known as a very notorious video nasty and just a notorious film altogether. When this movie came out, it made a lot of waves and its reputation has persisted. I'd say to this day, people still know about Faces of Death and it still has that kind of edgy, taboo reputation that is somewhat deserved, frankly, and is something that we're going to debate about whether or not it has merit and get into all those details in just a second. But first, if you haven't seen the movie before, it's basically made as a mockumentary. It purports to be a documentary by a doctor named Dr. Gross, if I recall the name correctly. And he's basically displaying various faces of death, various ways that death happens, and showing footage of ostensibly live deaths in an effort to kind of understand the concept of death, the meaning of death, and how we relate to it. And it's all kind of pseudo scientific and presented in this way to be like a serious take on things, but really is just an exploitation clip show of various deaths, some real, some fake. But I'll stop there. I won't spoil anything specific, although there's really nothing to spoil because it's not like a movie. It doesn't have a plot. It really does adhere to this documentary stuff, even though the documentary is pretty flimsy. Like it's a mockumentary, and it's pretty clear that it's pretty flimsy mockumentary just from the doctor's name going on, and like the acting of it and everything is just kind of shoddy. So you know right off the bat that you're really there just to have some exploitation kills on camera, and that's not a surprise. That is how it was marketed. That is what the audience was expecting. That is what they were given. That is what they wanted. That's what they were there for. And I know this because I was one of those people. I was a kid. This movie comes out in 1978, but I didn't see it till it came out in video. So I'm probably seeing it like at age 6 or 7 or something like that. Way too young to be watching this movie. But it was the movie everyone wanted to see. It was super taboo. It was super like, it was like the holy grail of watching like, forbidden taboo things because it was supposedly real death. And as a kid, I bought into that. I believed it. I thought all of this stuff was real. Watching it now, it's clear that some of this stuff is fake. It's just dated looking, gags and stuff like that that kind of shoddy and simple. And I honestly don't remember at the time. I remember people saying that some of it was faked or all of it was faked back when I was a kid too, and I didn't believe them. But, I gather people who were, older than me, a little more discerning than me, whatever, probably could see the seams that I couldn't see as a child, and I was really buying into it. I wanted to buy into it, and now I can see what they saw. So I think even at the time, people knew that some of it was faked, and I guess, there's been a lot of talk with people who made the movie, and some of the sheen has come off of it. Some of the allure and legend has come off of it because they've talked about, yeah, how they faked some of the death scenes. And the general consensus is about 40% of it is fake. And then the other 60% comes from like stock footage, like newsreel footage, and then unfortunately, like real footage of animals being killed, animal cruelty stuff, like slaughterhouse stuff, and like things like that. Nature kills, animals killing other animals and stuff like that. And that's the thing. As a kid, didn't really phase me all that much. In fact, I kind of didn't remember that because some of the more notable things, like the electric chair execution, fake, like that really resonated with me as a kid. The monkey brain scene, fake. Also those are the things as a kid that you latch onto and you focused on. So the animal cruelty stuff, the animal slaughterhouse stuff, as a kid didn't really think much about it. As a vegetarian now, that's the stuff that messes with me because that's real and it's disgusting. I'm not here to make you guys vegetarians, but watch Faces of Death and watch those scenes, and then have a hamburger or whatever, or some chicken, if you want. But like, nah, that really hits for me now, and so that's where like my attitude about this changes. To me, it was a fun exploitation thing. As a kid, a fun exploitation thing. As an adult, maybe I'm just getting a little soft in my old age. I don't know, but like. The point of this, the fun of it, is not really there for me anymore, and I know that it's exploitation. And but like some of the real stuff, like the woman that's killed by the semi truck, that is real footage from an accident. And then like I said, like the slaughterhouse stuff like that. I don't really need it. And putting it on a videotape to entertain people because again, this is not a real documentary. It's meant for people. It appeals to our pure prurient interests. And like I said, I had that prurient interest. I'm not above looking for gory stuff, even real gory stuff. Like it's like that train, that car wreck thing that you drive by, you can't help but rubberneck and look. I just accept that that's real. It's real in me. I watch that movie, but watching it now, it just doesn't sit the same for me. It's not a pleasant watch. I don't revisit this movie anymore. I didn't even revisit it for this video because I'm like, I've seen it. I know. I revisited it a few years ago, and that was the experience I had with it at that time. And I was just like, you know what? Kind of done with this movie. It's just not really there for me. It's really, again, it's kind of dull. It's not really. And it's got a cult following, or at least it did. And as far as I know, the cult following's still there, strong enough to have multiple sequels. It's been had multiple sequels, some official, some unofficial, and it's more of the same. More of the same. I think there's, mix again of fake and real footage, maybe more real footage in the subsequent entries, and the mockumentary format really falls apart. It's inconsistent. The storyline of the mockumentary really starts to fall apart on that. And I've seen some of the sequels, and it's more of the same. It's more of the same. So if you like the first one, you're gonna like the sequels. But I don't see the point, and especially in this age of YouTube and the internet, like you can go and find shocking videos of all kinds of things, car wrecks, shootings, things like that. So if you're interested in that stuff, you can see it. And I'm not gonna lie, I watch that stuff on YouTube or other, on the internet. So I don't really need it with Faces of Death because on the internet, it's pretty much it is what it is, right? Like, you're looking up something kind of gruesome, a weird accident that happened, especially those Russian car crash stuff. Kind of guilty pleasure, you know what I mean? Like, but Faces of Death just doesn't sit with me the way it used to. Like, I freely admit, when I was younger, I loved it. I loved the notoriousness of it. I love the edginess of it, the taboo aspect of it being real. All of that stuff really worked for me. It doesn't really work for me that way anymore now. It really just falls flat for me now. But I'm betting a lot of you have seen it, and you might have a different opinion. I mean, maybe you still think it's great. If you do, I'd love to hear from you in the comments. But I also like to know, when's the last time you watched it? Did you watch it recently and still really enjoy it, or has it been a while? Has it been a good 10+ years since you've seen it? And if you came to it late, did you enjoy it, knowing that part of it's fake and everything like that, or was it just kind of like, what's the big deal about this? Because having like lived this and remembering the stir it caused in America, the stir that it caused, I understand why it was a video nasty. I get why this one was banned. It's very easy for me to see why it was banned. I don't have a problem actually with that. I mean, I have a problem with like banning movies in general, but I don't have a problem with that one being one of them, especially compared to something like Driller Killer and some of the other movies that are on the list. But I understand it. But do you understand it? If you came to it late in the game, do you get it, or is it kind of just like, really, this movie's so obviously fake? I would love to know. Let me know in the comments your thoughts on it. But if you haven't seen it, once again, not really recommending it, but you know what it's about now. You know what it is. Check it out at your own risk. So that's going to do it for our selections for the video nasty subgenre. But of course, I've got some extra credit selections because I love me some video nasties, right? What can I say? I love watching these movies that are supposed to be taboo, and I'm going to share a few more of them with you. So the first one I'm going to mention is a movie called Devil Hunter. And Devil Hunter came out in 1980 and is directed by Jesus Franco, also known as Jess Franco. And I don't think we've actually talked about any Jess Franco movies on the channel. We might have talked about it at least once, but I have a feeling we're going to explore Jess Franco in a lot more detail in the future because I have a lot of thoughts and feelings about Jess Franco. But we'll set that aside for now. Instead, we'll focus on this one. And if you haven't seen it before, the movie is not the deepest of plots whatsoever. It's a model that gets kidnapped by ransomers and taken to this remote island. And a guy is hired to go and try to save her from her kidnappers. And not only does he have to fight off the kidnappers, but there's also this uh, cannibal zombie demon god that is out there attacking people as well. So he has to deal with not only the kidnappers, but he also has to deal with the cannibal zombie and hijinks abound as they tend to do in movies like this. But I don't want to spoil it for you, even though it's a paper thin plot. It's a paper thin plot, and it's not a particularly good movie, if I'm being honest with you, because most of the acting is pretty wooden. The effects aren't particularly great, and it's cheap and it's poor. But it's not. But it is. I'm talking about it because I like it anyways. And maybe it's because of Jess Franco. Like, I do like some Jess Franco movies. He's a prolific director and made a lot of movies, and he's known for gore and sleaze. Basically, nudity and blood is his thing. And you know what? I like those things. So, I tend to like those movies. But this is not one of his best. And I think Franco fans would definitely agree. This is not one of his best movies. He seems like he's not bringing his A game here, but even not at his best, he's still managing to shoot this in a way that is oftentimes very interesting, even though like it's got some really bad dubbing in it. It's got some horrendously bad acting in it, and the effects are again not always great. The makeup job on the cannibal zombie is it's actually pretty cool looking until you get too close to it, and I think Franco makes the mistake of showing it a little too much on screen. So that's a little unfortunate. But this movie really does for me sum up what a typical video nasty would be. It's got cannibalism on it. It's got violence in it. It's got nudity and sex in it. It's got everything that you kind of think of when you think of a video nasty. This is the kind of movie you're thinking of, kind of a B-list movie or a C-list or a D-list movie, really cheap, very exploitation, very appealing to the prurient interests, sex and violence. It's a standard video nasty. So that's why I wanted to bring it up as an extra credit movie. Is it's exactly what you think of when you're thinking. You're getting exactly what you think of when you think of video nasty with this movie. And like I said, we'll talk more about Franco in the future. This would not be the best example of his work, but it does still have just a slight amount of his talent and his skill as a director in there, despite all the negatives about this. I know this movie is not a very beloved movie. I like it because of, or maybe kind of, yeah, not in spite of, yeah, because of these faults rather than being in spite of them. I do find that it's charming. I feel like this movie is charmingly bad. Is it so bad it's good? Maybe, but it really wanted to be talked about here rather than the so bad it's good subgenre because it's just your standard video nasty. It's what you expect. It's you're getting exactly what's being promised to you, and yeah, recommending it? No, not really, because it's not particularly good, but it's worth mentioning, and I wanted to talk about it here. The next extra credit movie I'm talking about is a movie called Fight for Your Life. And Fight for Your Life came out in 1977. And the noteworthy thing about this one is that supposedly the reason why it made the video nasties list is not because of the violence and the nudity and the sexual violence, but rather because of the dialogue, specifically the racist dialogue in the movie is supposedly the reason why it makes the list. And I find that fascinating, but we're going to get into that in just a minute. If you haven't seen it before, the story is about three convicts who manage to escape captivity and go on the run, and they take a black family hostage in order to wait out the cops looking for them. And while they're holed up in this family's house, they subject them to various torments and ridicule and psychological and physical torture. And I'll stop there so as to not spoil the movie. And I'll say hijinks abound, but it's almost uncomfortable to say it that way because this movie's kind of gross from a racism point of view, and from other points of view as well. But it's actually pretty interesting. It's just not as satisfying as it could have or should have been. The movie is it's a blaxploitation film. It's usually called a blaxploitation film, although it starts out very much blaxploitation, and then it seems like it slides away from that. At least the fun aspects of blaxploitation. When I think of blaxploitation, I'm usually thinking of fun. The movies are tend to be kind of fun with cool black protagonists and great music and like sometimes ludicrous action and stuff like that. This movie starts that way, and then it just kind of goes away from that. Is it the racism really just starts to get very heavy handed, like just the racial epithets being thrown around just get it's so much of it. It gets exhausting. So I believe the stories that this movie wound up on the list because of the racial epithets, the racism in the movie. I believe that, but it is not devoid of sex and violence, sexual violence in particular. There is rape in this movie, sexual assault in this movie. There is other, murder and stuff like that, and torture. It's not as graphic as some of the other stuff we're talked about. It's definitely no Island of Death or Faces of Death. It's definitely not as graphic as all of that, probably because it's a little low budget. But there's definitely enough stuff in here that it should be on the video nasties list for its own, actual sex and violence or sexual violence in the movie. But supposedly it really is on there because of the dialogue. And that is really interesting to me. It's really interesting because while the dialogue is there and it's gross and it's frustrating and upsetting, it really isn't uh, by itself. I wouldn't think it'd be enough to make itself on the videos nasties list. It's not by itself, but that's what the research was telling me. And maybe I'm wrong. Maybe that's not the case. Maybe that was just like a cherry on top of the sex and violence stuff. But it's an interesting movie. And again, like I was saying, not as satisfying as it could have been. I think a really good premise, and I like the concept. It's kind of like funny games, but with a racial bent to it. And I liked the concept. Home invasion. The perpetrators are messing around with the family, and the family ultimately has to fight back. But the fighting back doesn't pay off as much as I wanted it to pay off. And that's where I say it's not as satisfying as it could have been. I would have really liked to seen the family, really rise to the occasion, and these villains get their comeuppance better than they did. It's not bad, but it could have been better. And so this movie maybe falls a little bit short in that regard, but I still think it's a good movie. I still actually think it's really interesting. If you can get past the racism and some of the sexual violence and stuff like that, it's actually a really interesting, good movie. It just, I feel like it left something on the table and could have given something a little bit more. But that is kind of a nitpick of a movie that I don't want to oversell. It's not a great movie. It's not amazing or anything like that. But it's a good premise that is done competently enough that I had a good time watching it. I never got bored. I never got frustrated with it. It is sometimes it's an uncomfortable watch. And the last extra credit movie I'm going to mention is a movie called Nightmare. Nightmare is also sometimes called Nightmares in a Damaged Brain, and it came out in 1981 and is an interesting movie for a couple of reasons that are behind the camera or, kind of behind the scenes rather than what is actually on the screen. Although what is on the screen is, violent enough to be qualified as a video nasty, and of course it was. But we're going to get into this in a second. First, if you haven't seen it before, the movie is about a guy suffering from mental health issues, mental problems, and he escapes his captivity, escapes the hospital he's at, and apparently goes back to stalk and kill his ex-wife and his children, who are unaware that he's been released and she started a new life. And there's a lot of interesting, weird violence and stalker stuff going on. But I don't want to spoil the movie for you, so I won't get into the details of it so much. But the movie is kind of your standard slasher type movie. It has a standard slasher type plot and it has some really good kills. And that's what we're here to talk about today are the kills. The gore in the movie is quite good for the most part. It's uneven, but it's quite good. There are some really graphic, gory kills with some really good gore effect gags in it. And the reason why is because Tom Savini, makeup artist extraordinaire and effects artist extraordinaire, did the effects. Or did he? Because that's what makes this movie so notorious, is that Savini claims up and down he did not work on this movie. But other people who did work on the movie remember him doing it, or at least doing some of the stuff on it. So it's weird because when you see the effects, some of them really do look like Savini, and some of them, they're not as good. So my theory is that he did some of the work and maybe he didn't do all the work. And there is some belief that part of this thing where he insists on not being credited for this because he didn't work on it actually has more to do with some sort of salary dispute or some sort of payment issue. But it's fascinating, and I couldn't really come to a definitive conclusion, but all the research I did on this led me to feel like Savini did in fact do at least some of the effects. And when you see him on screen, easy to believe it looks like something he would have done because it looks pretty good. Much better than this movie deserves, frankly, because the movie itself is fine. I love me a slasher movie, so I'm a little more forgiving to these things. So if you're not a big slasher fan, you probably aren't going to dig this movie as much as I did. I enjoy this movie quite a bit because I do like the kills, I do like the concept, but it's not as good as many other movies. And so, what elevates it, what makes it better than the any other slasher movie is the kills. So yeah, Savini being in there is good because the movie is not, it's a standard slasher, but it's trying to be something more. And I realized this more when I did the research. The director had these pretentious aspirations of making commentary on violence and mental health and stuff like that that really doesn't come through in the finished product. His pretentious aspirations really don't filter through. He fails in that regard. And the problem is that the movie suffers as a result. You can feel the movie trying to be more important than it actually is. And that's why I say it's fine. If it just was a slasher movie, if it just revel in being a slasher movie instead of trying to be more important than that, you would have a blast of a movie on your hands. I would be raving about it. But because it's trying to be more important and failing at it, because I don't mind movies being important or having a message and having something to say, but because it fails at doing this, it winds up just being kind of fine. It's an okay time. It's not a waste of my time. I enjoyed it. I would watch it again. I own it. But it's not a great movie. So once again, I'm not recommending the movie. I'm hardly recommending anything today. But if you like slasher movies, you'd probably have a good time watching it. And it'd be interesting if you do watch it. Let me know. Do you think it's Savini's work? Do you think Tom Savini did these gore effects, or did somebody just do a good job of mimicking him and they're trying to leverage his name? Let me know in the comments below. So that's going to do it for our exploration into video nasties. If you like this kind of stuff, I definitely recommend the documentary Video Nasties, The Definitive Guide. I think it's called Moral Panic and Censorship and Videotape, something like that. If you watch our horror documentary video, I talk about it at length in that video because it's a great documentary. If you want to know more about this, because we just scratched the surface of it, dig into that documentary. You can also, of course, there's plenty of other resources on the internet, but that documentary in and of itself is a high point for me. So check that one out if you haven't, if you want to know more about Video Nasties. And as for us, we are going to change our focus now and get into some horror trivia pursuit. It's that time of the video where I'm going to look at a trivia pursuit card live on camera and try to answer it. And we're going to go with the killer subgenre for the obvious reason that most of these video nasties have to do with like a killer. They're slashers and stuff like that. So we're going to look at the killer category. And the question is, what kind of critical reception did 1960s Peeping Tom receive when released in theaters? Positive or negative? And I'm going to tell you right off the bat, this is a stupid question. And I'm pretty sure I know the answer, but it's a stupid question because it's a 50-50 question. It's basically a yes or no question, positive or negative. They didn't even say it in the card, positive or negative. They could have just said, what kind of reaction did Peeping Tom get at the time it was released, and just leave it at that and let you fill in the blank yourself, because I was already going to say what I was going to say. And I don't feel like giving me the prompts of positive or negative does anything other than limit my answer to one of these two things. And it makes for, not a very fun question because it's a 50-50 chance. You're just guessing here. And I'm going to feel stupid if I'm wrong. I'm not going to lie to you. I'm going to feel stupid if I'm wrong, but I'm pretty sure I know what it is. I'm not even going to spend a lot of time giving you guys a chance to think about it because it's one or the other. It's positive or negative. So there's not much for you to think about, but I'm going to explain my reasoning when I give my answer. And I'm going to give that answer right now. I'm saying it's negative. It was a negative response because I remember, Peeping Tom came out in 1960, same time as Psycho did. Peeping Tom came out, I think, a little bit earlier than that. And I believe the response was negative for both of the movies because of the violence. In particular, I think Peeping Tom got a lot of flack because it was showing from the killer's point of view, and people didn't think it was appropriate to be identifying with the killer, for the audience to be identifying with the killer and seeing things from his point of view, which of course became de rigueur for slashers in the future. Peeping Tom, very influential and important movie in horror cinema, and we may be talking about that again at some point in the future. But and, I talked about it a little bit when we talked about Psycho. But yeah, I think that if I recall correctly, people didn't like that. They thought that was a bad thing. That was a negative response. So that is my answer, negative. And hopefully you got your answer locked in because I'm going to look at the card. And the answer is negative. The negative backlash essentially ended the career of director Michael Powell. And you know what? I think I remember having a conversation in the comments when I did the video and I talked about Psycho. We talked about Peeping Tom a little bit, and I believe in the comments we had a conversation about Michael Powell's career basically being ended because of that movie. And I'd forgotten that until I read that card right now. But that's accurate. Yeah, like I remember even looking it up and saying, yeah, it pretty much stops after that. And it's unfortunate. It's a very good movie, wound up being very influential and very historical, having a historical significance and importance. So it's unfortunate that happened. Not the greatest of questions, but I got it right, and I'd been on a little bit of a losing streak. So nice to right the ship a little bit. So hopefully you guys got it right as well. If you haven't seen Peeping Tom, I recommend check it out. If you haven't seen these movies, again, I'm going to say it one more time. Watch at your own risk. You get an idea of what they're about. So not for everybody, today's videos, today's movies. But if you have checked them out, let's keep the conversation going in the comments below because Video Nasties is something that's fun to talk about. I enjoy them quite a bit. A lot of people are really into them. So let's keep talking in the comments below. And then next week, we'll talk about something completely different. Until then, class dismissed.